Okay, so I'm very happy to introduce and to have Valentina Pisanty with us, because actually one of your books, namely Educare all'odio in Italian, Educating to Hatred, which was looking precisely at and dissecting really in difesa della razza, in defense of race, which was one of the main tools of the propaganda machine in the fascist regime, was really influential for me, and really in thinking also how much I didn't know enough actually about Italian history, and what a shame it is to not study critically this journal in school. Like, I feel this is really something we should, as Italian citizens or European citizens, all study and know about, precisely to sort of cut through there is a classic that we say in Italian, which is called Italiani brava gente, which means Italians are good people, which also is a kind of like myth of Italians being hospitable, never having really engaged in the sort of racist regime of either colonial times or fascists and Nazis later. So there's a lot of responsibility that Italy and Italians have actually not taken over the past, which I think is one of the ways in which we might be able to understand better the type of xenophobia and racism that still defines the current moment. Anyway, this is something that Valentina will talk about. Valentina is a semiotic, Italian semiotic, and professor of semiotics at the University of Bergamo. She has studied also negationist theories of the Holocaust and racist phenomena. And she has been editorial coordinator of something called Accepting Diversity, which was a kind of interactive manual on tolerance, which was brought together by, or let's say brought together by a project by Umberto Eco, Furio Colombo, and Jacques Le Goff at the Académie Universelle des Cultures, I suppose, in Paris, yeah. She has written various books, of which Educating to Hatred is one of, but there is more, and particularly having really looked into, I would say, the negationism theories in regards to the Holocaust, particularly in how the logic of negationism has actually developed and been legitimized in one way or the other. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Antonia. Thank you, everybody. So I will be talking about this publication that came out between 1938 and 1943 in Italy. And I will start with this. Get out. Okay. I will start with this picture. Some of you may recognize it, perhaps. This was the front cover of the first 3 issues of La Difesa della Razza, which is the official organ of fascist racism, published every 2 weeks, as I was saying, between 38 and 43, with the precise aim of formulating and disseminating a scientific, in inverted commas, doctrine of the race that might justify, in the eye of the Italian public opinion, colonial policy and, above all, state anti-Semitism. The purpose was therefore to persuade Italians that colonialism, eugenics, the prohibition of mixed marriages, and the race laws were political choices legitimized by the laws of nature. So the reason why I find this picture particularly interesting is I will kind of close read it because I think we can extrapolate a lot of information from the way it was thought out. Because as you can see, the photo montage shows 3 heads, each representing one of the 3 alleged human races, Aryan or Aryan Roman, in the first case, Semitic and Hamitic, as in Ham, as in African, separated by a gladius, which is a short Roman sword that symbolized the virile fascist will or determination to keep the Aryan Roman race pure from the nefarious influence of the other 2. The Aryan race is represented as a head of a Roman statue, which was an idealization of a mythical Italianness, which was supposed to be the repository of ancient heroic virtues. The Hamitic race, the African race, is personified by an African girl who, as you can see, is the only subject in the flesh. And in the intention of those who made the photomontage, it's supposed to trigger connotations of animality. The picture, by the way, was taken by an Italian anthropologist, Lidio Cipriani, who at the time, as was customary at the time, traveled around the African colonies to record a variety of human samples, much in the way zoologists registered and kept a record of exotic animal species. Now, a polemical juxtaposition between culture and nature is evident. It's created between the two heads, where the noble Aryan Roman race obviously stands for culture and civilization, while the savage African stands for nature and for barbarianism, if you want, wilderness or whatever. In between, there is the Semitic head, Semitic race, represented by a bas-relief with the stylized features of a caricature. The Jewish head has some aspects in common with both the other two, the two figures that frame it, because like the Roman statue, it is an artifact and therefore a cultural product, a cultural object. And in this case, the opposition between culture and nature is not at stake, as was the case with the African head, but everything is played out within the sphere of culture. But like the photograph of the African girl, the image of the Jew is far from the aesthetic ideal, classic ideal of the Aryan race. Its features are grotesque and irregular. The overall impression is that whereas the Hamitic race is represented the denial of all forms of civilization and therefore lent itself to being colonized and civilized, you know, the white man's burden and all that, the Semitic race constitutes a degeneration of civilization itself. Now, the image illustrates a distinction that is very important within the studies of racist thought, which is the distinction between racism of dominance. I could paraphrase it as, the other is inferior and therefore I will conquer or exploit or dominate him, and a form of racism of exclusion. The other is inferior and therefore I will isolate or avoid or drive him out or eliminate him. In the first case, the other is seen as a savage lacking all culture, and therefore the opposition in play is, as I was saying, that between culture, the culture of the racist in-group, and the non-culture attributed to the stigmatized out-groups. In the second case, the other is seen as the bearer of a system of values that are antithetical to those of the racists, and hence the relevant opposition is between culture and anti-culture. Now, racism of dominance or dominion, which is typically exemplified by colonialism, leads to subjugation of the people conquered, but also to a process of creolization between cultures. And there have been colonizers who theorized racial intermixture as a form of possible way of regenerating humanity. I will show you some colonial postcards which are quite representative of something that I want to tell you now, because history teaches us that where there is contact between different people, even when the contact takes the form of a conquest, there is also a tendency to crossbreeding, as the following the talk will show better than I can do. It is quite common for colonizers to practice various forms of miscegenation, from sexual slavery to ethnic rape or to proper marriage also. And that is why most racist propaganda was, and still is, far more lenient towards the union between a white man and a non-white woman than vice versa. Look at this other image and think about all the times that we have seen similar things even in our present day. Exclusivist racism leads to segregationism, apartheid, and in certain extreme cases to deportation. This does not, however, mean that one is less bad than the other, because both forms have proved that they can lead to genocide. But it's above all exclusivist racism that needs to work out a fully fledged theory of the race, theory of racist theory, doctrine, whatever. The reason is quite simple. Racism of dominance has less need to find justifications because it is founded on a logic of prevarication that anyone can grasp intuitively, whether they agree with it or not. I am stronger than you, therefore I shall and I have the right to subjugate you. Racism of exclusion, on the other hand, hinges on an idea of racial purity that requires some additional explanation. Because if separation of the races were really a part of nature's plan or God's plan or whoever, one might wonder, then why is crossbreeding such a spontaneous and widespread phenomenon at all levels of organic life? Why do we sometimes feel instinctively attracted to that which seems so different? Why have humans always been so inclined to remixing their gene pools, etc., etc.? Faced with such questions, exclusivist racists have been obliged and are today obliged to construct a set of complex arguments that show that miscegenation is not a natural phenomenon at all, but that quite the contrary, nature or whoever acts in its stead loves purity and abhors hybridization. Now, before I go any further, I need to provide a clear definition of what I mean by racism, a term that covers a wide range of different meanings, even though they all share a common reference to a generally intolerant attitude. As it is used today, this word seems to refer to a fuzzy concept that we could represent in the form of an onion-like structure, at whose center we find the discourses and practices founded on a racist doctrine, racism in the strict sense, while in the more superficial layers, the conceptual construction is less and less evident as it gives way to certain interpretive and behavioral knee-jerk responses, xenophobia and recourse to racial stereotypes. Now, there is an evident continuity between the various levels, if you want, between one layer and the next, because recourse to prejudices and racial stereotypes often, but not always, results in xenophobia. Xenophobia often, but not always, results in racism proper. Nonetheless, it's worth disentangling or distinguishing between the different levels in order to avoid undue superimpositions. Also because, by the way, many of today's xenophobes mention the fact that they do not apply or believe overtly in some kind of doctrine of the race, and that makes them, according to them, non-racists. But they do belong to the intermediate layer, the xenophobic layer, and as I will try to prove very quickly, it is in no way better than being racists in the strict sense of the word. Recourse to stereotypes and prejudices does not imply per se a racist or a xenophobic attitude, apart from the fact that there are some apparently positive stereotypes, you know, the intelligent Jews, rhythmic Africans, and so on, usually double-edged swords, of course. Stereotypes are an essential feature of the way we take into account reality, the reality that surrounds us, and from the day we begin to talk, and possibly even sooner, we tend to pigeonhole the experiences that strike us as types that allow us to recognize and foresee their various tokens. Okay. Despite the wild generalization that this method involves, recourse to stereotypes and prejudices does not necessarily imply a hostile attitude towards the groups subjected to the simplifying action of the stereotypes. But it is rather symptomatic of a strategy of cognitive economy, if you want, or another way of saying of extreme intellectual laziness, which becomes a social problem on two conditions. When, one, the stereotypes become so inflexible that they are completely that they completely help avoid acknowledging world data that doesn't fit with them, first of all, and secondly, stereotypes are employed to bolster up a systematic rejection of the other, a rejection that can remain virtual or result in a variety of intolerant forms of behavior. The historical causes of this rejection may be many, territorial, religious, political, and so on, but at the base of its consensus, there often lurks the fear of being destroyed or contaminated by the other. And here we get into our next layer, xenophobia, aversion or fear of foreigners. Is not racism yet, not in the strict sense, because you can be xenophobic without necessarily anchoring this attitude to any specific doctrine of the race. In fact, this kind of wild, untamed intolerance appeals to wholly elementary drives that cause a rejection of diversity and is characterized by the fact that the other is perceived as a threat, physical threat, cultural threat, or whatever. Threat to the survival of the group that one identifies with. Xenophobes draw a clear distinction between us and them, imagine that the clash between the two is inevitable and comparable to the opposition between good and bad, good and evil, and tend to attribute the others with intentions that are specifically hostile or in any case deleterious for their own group or identity. Xenophobia may exist even in the absence of a conscious ideological superstructure, an organic theory that attempts to give a scientific basis to the idea of racial inequality. But this does not make it any less noxious than racism proper. As Umberto Eco put it, the most dangerous form of intolerance is precisely that which arises in the absence of any doctrine by way of elementary impulses, since it cannot be criticized or kept at bay with rational arguments. Now, I'm not sure I totally agree with Eco's thought, but I think we should consider it anyway. Because I feel that when racism proper, when a doctrine comes along, usually it means it's too late to do anything at all, whether you can, and no logical argument can help in any way at that point. Anyway, racism in the strict sense is a relatively recent phenomenon whose roots, as we all know, are sunk in the intellectual landscape of 18th century Europe and reaches its fullest expression between the 19th and the 20th century. By exploiting a pre-existing reservoir of wild intolerance, it justifies the rejection of the other on the basis of a system of arguments presented as objective or rational in a way similar to the pseudo-arguments used by the wolf in Phaedrus's tale, a posteriori arguments. And these arguments may be of various kinds, be they biological, pseudo-scientific, be they ultranationalistic, race as lineage rather than race as blood, be they spiritual or esoteric, race as some kind of vague form of ancestral spirit. And in fact, if we read through the issues of La Difesa della Razza, we find traces of all three of these trends, of these strands of racism, racist doctrine. The difference between the three lies in the kind of arguments that they use to provoke the desired effects. The effects are often the same. The arguments can be different. Many of these arguments, as I was saying, are found in the pages of La Difesa della Razza. And if we had more time, I would show you how various incompatible doctrines fought each other to the bitter end within the pages of the magazine itself, the journal itself, but inside the editorial board, and sometimes even in the pages, as I was saying, themselves, in a desperate bid to conquer Mussolini's approval, which was funny actually, because Mussolini kept changing his mind about which theory of the race he liked best, and he kept swapping from one to the other when it was more convenient for him to tighten his alliance with Nazi Germany. He tended to give his support to the biological racists who were awkwardly trying to prove that there was an identical DNA between Italians and Germans and absolutely nothing in common between Italians and the French, for example. But when, on the other hand, he had moments of autarkic pride, he would give way, he would give his support to the others, and especially to the nationalists and to the esoteric strands, in a bid to prove that, for example, there was a continuity between the present Italians and the ancient Romans, an uninterrupted lineage between the two. And they usually did this through some vague pseudo-arguments and through the use of a lot of images, because in this journal, images were far more important than texts. They had a far greater effect than texts. Anyway, we don't have time, and thrilling as it is, this storyline would lead us astray. My purpose today is to discuss the continuities and discontinuities between fascist racism and contemporary xenophobia. Because, as we know, since the end of the war, the Second World War, racist doctrines have become heavily laden with negative connotations, can no longer be used without reminding people of the abuses, the brutality, the massacres that have been perpetrated in their name. Based on the repudiation of its past involvement with anti-Semitic and racist ideologies, the official narrative of European post-war identity acknowledges the Holocaust and, albeit to a lesser extent, colonialism as its negative founding events. Never again is a solemn promise that accompanies numberless public ceremonies in a bid to forge a common sensitivity regarding Europe's ultimate ethical and political values. Yet, the current resurgence of hostile prejudices towards minority groups all over the continent suggests that the past claims of racist rhetoric have found new social and new cultural environments in which to proliferate, not just in Europe, all over the world, but we're dealing with Europe right now. And we may wonder how this can possibly have happened. Now, I will show you just a small selection of some of the stuff that came out in Italy and in Switzerland, the Italian part of Switzerland, in the past few years, just to give you an idea. But of course, there are many, many more that we could consider. This is a particularly nasty one. Now, let's go back to our first slide. Exclusion and dominance were easy categories to apply in a context where it was obvious which particular group each racist attitude was aimed at. Dominance was the attitude towards the colonized African people who lived abroad, a casa loro, as today's Lega would say, while exclusion was directed at the only significant minority living in Italy at the time, which was Jews. Actually, they weren't the only ones, because there were gypsies as well, but for some reason, fascist propaganda preferred to target the Jews. The difference is noticeable all through the pages of La difesa della razza, that those were the two targets, and that there were two completely different sets of rhetoric applied to Africans on the one hand and Jews on the other. Take a look at some of these pictures, for example. Again, pictures more important than texts. This was the standard. And imagine, now, we're on the Jews already. Imagine generations of people that were bombarded, whether they liked it or not, whether the families secretly agreed with it or not, but they were daily bombarded with this kind of imagery. Now, I'd be interested to ask cognitive scientists how this kind of unfiltered, irrational message can put its roots in people's minds much more than any rational verbal kind of argument may do. And in fact, that is what we're seeing now, the roots that have been, are uncovered right now. Anyway, Africans were inevitably depicted as uncivilized savages, intellectually inferior, sometimes laughable, especially when they tried to behave as humans, like when they wore Western clothes. They were ridiculized because of their absurd aspirations to look like they were proper 100% humans. Very often showed as herds of wild beasts, more or less docile, more or less tameable, but precisely for this reason, easily influenced by hidden manipulators. Guess who? In this case, somebody who was shifty, devious, a conniving crook, hidden behind behind whatever the scene, the curtains, as in the case of this cover of the Jew. So Jews, on the other hand, were these proper enemies, as I was saying, shifty, devious, often represented as in caricature forms, and often represented as double. They are often the two faces of Jewishness, and often represented as either vultures, which obviously gives way to connotations of rapacity, and spiders, the idea of the conspiracy. So we could actually work on these visual metaphors, because it's not just rapacity. Vultures eat carrion, eat dead stuff. So what does all this mean? What kind of implication can be triggered by this kind of imagery? Now, we may wonder why the Aryan Roman identity needed both enemies, external and internal, to assert its symbolic supremacy. A possible explanation is that the image of the African savage was not perceived by fascist racists as sufficiently threatening to serve as a counterpart to the Italian Superman. According to racists, the Negro, as they called it, and please try to see the whatever quotation marks every time I use this word. Let me not always have to do them. The Negro was so evidently an inferior being that there was not even a question of discussing the matter. As a matter of fact, it wasn't just the fascist racists who believed that. If you have a look at the entry, Negro entry on the Encyclopedia Britannica, on the various editions starting from the beginning of the 19th century, all through great part of the 19th century, and read the kind of description that was considered to be standard for the time, then you can see that there was not even it was not even a question of trying to persuade anybody of the inferiority of Africans. It was just, deposited in common sense. But then, if the Negro was commonly described as the missing link between man and ape, how could he constitute a worthy challenge for Italians eager to demonstrate the supremacy of their own race and civilization? The contradiction was overcome thanks to the introduction of another enemy, far more astute and devious, on which to convey all the social tensions accumulated within the nation. Unlike the Negro, the Jew lent himself to being portrayed as a fiendishly conscious adversary, the bearer of a system of values and an existential project that was totally antithetic, opposed to that claimed by the Aryan race. In short, the Jew was given a precise agency, if you want, a precise destructive will that was denied to the Africans. So it is also no coincidence, and you shall see why I keep going back to this picture. It is no coincidence that the Jew is placed at the center of the photomontage, because one of the recurring theses in La Difesa della Razza and in later strands of anti-Semitism is that Jews are supposed to be the main culprits of the bastardization of the Aryan race. Under the pretext of the struggle for civil rights on behalf of other ethnic minorities, for example, in the United States, Jews who notoriously discourage marriages, mixed marriages with their own group, with members of their own group, were accused of having willfully polluted Aryan blood with Hamitic blood in order to weaken Western civilization and then, of course, proceed to its conquest. First you kill it, then you eat it, exactly like vultures do. Well, actually, vultures don't kill. My hypothesis is that all racist and all xenophobic stances involve this kind of triadic structure. You need three things for a racist mentality to develop. You need the idea of a pure and innocent people. You need a wild and contaminating multitude. And you need a wicked enemy lurking behind the scene. Let us now cut to the present day. Now, since the days of the defense of the race, decolonization has profoundly transformed the geopolitical frame of reference. Thousands of people from places that were once invaded ask for asylum in Europe, and it is no longer us who go to them, they are the ones who are coming to us. Without trying to minimize the social, political, cultural, and economic impact of these global events, it is quite clear that current xenophobes ride the hardships and feed on the more or less justified fears that migrations arouse. As we all know, living, for all those of us who live in Italy, but it's not so different in the States, I suppose, these days. Footage of boats full of desperate people awaken atavistic terrors of invasion, and at the same time, a part of these migrants are integrated in the production system, basically as an exploited and underpaid workforce, yet necessary to the economy and welfare system of the various countries of arrival, in Italy, perhaps even more than in other countries. As far as our analysis is concerned, the relevant aspect is the way in which such transformations restructure the xenophobic imaginary landscape. What happens? Because you can see the difference. While in the past, the two forms of racism, dominance and exclusion, carved out clearly distinct areas of action, one external and the other internal to the national borders, each with its own rhetoric and its own battery of pseudo-arguments. What happens when the typical exploitation of colonial conquest is internalized and the two categories overlap and the subjugated savage is perceived simultaneously as the enemy to be driven away? Both things. How can you do both things at the same time? Now, on a strictly doctrinal level, today xenophobes have developed updated models of dominance and exclusion, as perhaps some of us know already. The two fundamental trajectories of racist thought, based on the opposition between culture and nature on the one hand and culture and anti-culture on the other, are set aside to be replaced by an apparently neutral framework based on the opposition between culture and other cultures, the differentialist model that we have all heard of, especially in the 90s, which avoids all reference to races as biological entities and shuns direct value judgments concerning the superiority of one's own race or culture over the others. All that it states is that in order to guarantee each group the right to cultivate its own cultural traditions, and in order to avoid unwanted hybridizations, it is preferable that everyone remain faithful to his or her own cultural identity, better if in his or her own home or a place of origin, as slide I chose to represent this concept. Apparently, differentiation is based on a principle of profound respect for the cultural identities of different groups, and indeed, this approach seems to display several traits in common with a so-called multiculturalist model, which in the 90s was considered to be the utmost expression of an open and tolerant society. However, the question is whether other cultures are simply allowed to nurture their own separate identities, or whether such separation is in any way compulsory, and also why should it be desirable to support the tendency which may be found within the traditional currents of each group to limit contacts and exchanges with other groups and other cultures? What about individual members of any given group who would prefer to adopt a more permeable stance towards the various cultural stimuli that they receive from their mixed environment? One gets the impression that the differentialist approach ultimately reproposes, albeit in a more ideologically acceptable way, the same intolerance towards miscegenation that characterized the exclusivist forms of traditional racism. Now, to understand whether this impression is founded, we may analyze how the posters of ultranationalist parties interpret this differentialist doctrine, which is the most common one nowadays. How are the others represented, considering that their diversity should not, in theory, imply any value judgment? How, in other words, have traditional stereotypes changed since the times of La Difesa della Razza? Now, in some cases, some groups, such as the Roma or Gypsies, the negative stereotype have not only remained substantially unchanged, if anything, it has got worse. If we compare the images published in the fascist magazine there on the left to those of the current Lega Nord up on the screen, we notice an intensification of the traits of physical and spiritual degradation attributed to the gypsies, represented as filthy beggars and depraved child thieves. That was a question I had for you about there's no fake because anything can be reframed. What about somebody who says Romas steal children, for example? Anyway, we can discuss that later. There is no frame that can find this acceptable because it's just not true in any frame possible. Anyway, but these current images, current representations, are no longer tempered by 19th century representations of picturesque Esmeraldas or violin players or whatever, Bohemian culture, whose traces were still visible, vaguely visible, as you can see in the fascist propaganda. There was still some form of fascination for the Romas. What has happened since then? That the anti-Roma imagery has been nourished by the spectacle of social and economic degradation in which part of the Roma population found itself following the fall of socialism, the socialist systems in Eastern Europe, and after the 90s wars in the Balkans. So what do we understand from this? That all stereotypes are in fact a mixture of heterogeneous and often contradictory elements, some of which are totally fictitious, such as the Romas as children kidnappers. Others date back to earlier cultural formations, the Romas as an essentially nomadic people. Others still to fragments of real-world experience, albeit emphasized and reframed and unduly generalized, for example, the Romas as pickpockets or thieves. In other cases, you can see how the mixture is so cemented that there is no falsifying experience that may totally dissolve it. The stereotype of the savage African is so deeply rooted in the European dirty conscience that it survives all counter-evidence. Xenophobic thinking does not travel along the lines of Aristotelian logic and does not give a fig about the principle of the excluded middle. This was repeatedly proved by the most vociferous members of the Lega Nord a few years ago with this revolting campaign against Minister Kyenge, which I prefer not to dwell on, except to underline that when people start attributing animal features to a person on account of her national or cultural identity, then it means that the threshold of potentially violent racism has abundantly been surpassed. On the other hand, and which this is more counterintuitive if you want, on the other hand, the Arab stereotype has undergone a remarkable metamorphosis since Mussolini's time, at least in Italy. In the light of today's Islamophobia, one is struck by the fond portraits that the defenders of the race used to dedicate to the nomadic people of Iraq, celebrated on account of their sense of friendship, virility, spirituality, intelligence, and pride. The reason for such admiration is quite clear, actually. It's historical. It's contingent, because from the 1920s to 1932, Iraq had been a British mandate, and by the end of the 30s, when this article was written, British influence on the country was still quite strong, though opposed by local populations. And therefore, according to the tribal logic, according to which our enemies' enemies are our friends, the Iraqis were celebrated by fascists by virtue of their resistance to the British, and also to the fact, and to the Jews, and also to the fact that they stayed in their place without bothering the Italians in their own homes. Now, much water has passed, well, what's the expression? Much has gone under the bridge since that time. There is no doubt that Islamophobia has become one of the most widespread and most toxic forms of contemporary racism, especially since some leading writers, Battier, Bernard Lewis, Oriana Fallaci, just to name a few, have given credence to the theory that the expansion of the Islamic population in Europe is the result of a precise project of colonization of the West, aimed at destroying its ethical, political, religious, and cultural foundations. Now, I will not go into the complex deconstruction of this catastrophic dystopia, which would require a lot of time and patience, also because it feeds, among other things, on images of real events, such as the terrorist attacks, that should be untangled from the ghosts that they generate. But that is precisely the point. Instead of unraveling the issues to face them one by one in a critical and effective way, Eurabia theorists mix them and confuse them in a single prophecy aimed at self-fulfillment. It is easy to guess how this great apocalyptic narrative is grafted onto the thesis of the barbaric invasions so dear to the Northern League and to other European parties that are similar all over Europe. The two rhetorical constructions share the same phobia of, say, racial mingling on the one hand, and the same deep narrative, the clash of civilization, on the other. In both cases, the invasion, the imagined invasion, is perceived as the antechamber of total destruction, total. And it is much more difficult, however, to attribute a specific role to the Arab immigrant in this narrative. The Arab immigrant, who in the Northern League discourses appears at the same time as similar and different from all the other immigrants, the other groups, his cronies, if you want. And I would like you to have a look at this. This was a Northern League poster from a few years back. And I find it particularly interesting because you can see that there is a difference between the various stereotypes of the various groups. Now, the basic idea, as you can easily see, is that in the xenophobic imagination, all immigrants are potential parasites. Parasites who, with the blessing of European institutions and national intellectual elites, suck vital resources out of the nation's healthy yet exhausted body, thus reducing decent, hardworking Italian people to poverty. That is the narrative. The impulses are the primordial ones that define racism of dominance. Only in an inverted perspective, which I find interesting. Fascists represented themselves as members of a strong, superior race who, in compliance with the laws of nature, subjugated and expropriated the African savages. Today's xenophobes, on the other hand, perceive themselves as the weak ones, the victims of oppression. By invoking the right to self-defense, which they extend to property and women as well as to personal safety, they claim to defend their stuff from hordes of barbarian grabbers. In this perspective, all immigrants are illegal and therefore, according to xenophobes, thieves and criminals. But Islamic immigrants are more criminal than others, as proved by the grim expression in their caricatures that really are strikingly similar to the caricatures of Jews in the Difesa della Razza. What makes them different from the Romas, the Chinese, and the sub-Saharan Africans, according to the League's propaganda, Islamic immigrants do not limit themselves to exploit the gullibility with which Italian past governments have allegedly endowed them with all sorts of undeserved privileges, such as 3-star hotels in which they allegedly reside and all that, at the expense, of course, of Italian impoverished taxpayers. They have something else in mind, and the sword, the scimitar that emerges from underneath the jalaba is there to prove it. So the Arab character occupies, in some way, the same exact position as the Jew in the fascist propaganda. And I have compared the two images to make this claim literal. If you look at them, the position is the same. In between the sword, only a sword in this case is on the other side, there is this character with Semitic traits who is the main culprit for everything that is happening. What perfidious intentions then do these angry savages have? This is where the myth of Eurabia is grafted. They want to conquer us, as we did in the past centuries, even though ours was a civilizing mission. Maybe they want revenge, but weren't they supposed to be savages, Bedouins, little more evolved than African bingo bongos? This is the problem. How could they possibly elaborate such a diabolical plan? There must be somebody who directs them from above. And I feel that there is a kind of dissonance in the way the Arabs are represented. And there are ways of getting out of this dissonance, and that's how I will conclude my argument. My interpretation is that the 21st century Arab stereotypes are a product of a graft between the true roles that were once entrusted to the Africans on the one hand and the Jews on the others. The former were considered intellectually incapable, and therefore their threat was exclusively biological. The latter were apparently weak and unarmed, but cunning as snakes, and they were thought to plot against the spirit of the Aryan race with the tools of culture on which they were supposed to hold a monopoly. When the two roles merge, the contradictory elements that define them produce a puzzling monster, half beast and half devil, something like that. The Arab, in other words, is a Jewish Negro in this kind of propaganda, an uncivilized, beastly, intellectually inferior creature who nevertheless disposes of an immense array of economic, cultural and political resources, as well as the sophisticated mind that is necessary to plan a strategy of world conquest. Well, how can you put the two things together? It's a bit like putting together, you know, the Uruk-hai and Saruman. How can you be at the same Uruk-hai and Saruman at the same time without people noticing that there is something that doesn't really fit between the two? It's a bit like the famous rabbit-duck figure. Either you see the duck or you see the rabbit. You can't see them both at the same time. So either you see one or the other. And yes, of course, the sheikhs may be. The sheikhs may occupy that role, but how can you? So I'll just come up with the answer. The latest answer is this, which shows how everything goes back to the point of departure. You find another enemy who seems to work in both ways. The Soros myth that has sprung out of somebody's hat in the past few years. In particular, it was born out of the imagination, you wouldn't guess, of two American Jews, Arthur Finkelstein and Eli Birnbaum, who were working as consultants for Benjamin Netanyahu in 1998 and for Viktor Orban's electoral campaign in 2008. And they worked out, totally, you know, knowing what they were doing, this conspiracy theory that has proved immensely successful in the past 10 years as it went viral all over Europe and the States and is now used by governmental propaganda in Italy as well as Hungary, Poland and the States to discredit all claims in favor of migrants' rights. You know, Soros is indeed the perfect manipulator. As a globally famous speculator, the man who broke the Bank of England in 1992, he's also a philanthropist, but more importantly, he is a Jew who survived the Holocaust and the Soviet regime, and his name vaguely sounds like Saruman too. So here goes the fake. Under the facade of his capillary philanthropic work, Soros is accused of secretly planning to substitute European native populations with hordes of Islamic immigrants with the precise purpose of destroying the foundations of Western society and thereby conquering the continent by means of his overpowering financial supremacy. Now, does this story sound familiar? Well, it should. It is exactly the same allegation that the Nazi fascist defenders of the race used when they accused the Jews of having willfully polluted Aryan blood with Hamitic blood in order to weaken Western civilization. This is the ultimate strength of racist stereotyping as an instrument of political consensus. People believe what they already know, fundamentally. Okay, thank you.